Hi everyone, my name is Danielle Hett and I'm a PhD student at the University of Birmingham, and this is one of several talks as part of the ESRC Festival of Social Science. And my talk today is going to be covering post-traumatic stress and memory. So I'd like you to imagine this scene. You're a member of the jury watching the victim of a violent crime being questioned. The victim is highly emotional, her answers are a little vague, and her memory for the event is disorganised with details missing. This woman has been through a traumatic event, and it's important to understand the ways in which trauma memories are processed and retrieved at a later stage. In this talk, I'll provide a brief overview of the different ways in which a traumatic event can affect our memory, drawing on key cognitive models of PTSD. So we know that over 70% of people worldwide are exposed to at least one traumatic event within their lifetime. And in line with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, known as the DSM, in version 5, traumatic events can be defined as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Key examples include sexual, physical, emotional, or domestic abuse, natural disasters, military combat, or the sudden loss of a loved one. The DSM-5 also recognises that trauma exposure can take many different forms. So, for example, there's direct personal exposure, so the event happening to oneself. There's witnessing the trauma happening to other people. So, for example, witnessing a car accident happening in front of you. There's indirect exposure, so just learning that the trauma has happened to a close family member or a loved one. And there's actually a fourth type of trauma exposure in this version of the DSM, and this is repeated exposure to aversive details. So this, for instance, includes police officers who, due to the nature of their work, they're repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse, so repeatedly exposed to traumatic images. And in this version of the DSM, this recognises those types of situations as being another type of trauma exposure, which can also lead to the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. We also know that individuals will vary in how they respond psychologically to traumatic events. So in other words, two people could go through the exact same experience, but they could respond and cope very differently afterwards. It's also normal and common to experience some distress following a traumatic event. So common symptoms include reliving aspects of the event, difficulty sleeping, high levels of arousal, as well as feelings of shock, shame, anger, and even confusion. And for most people, these symptoms will just naturally dissipate over time, so over the following days or weeks after the trauma. But we also know that for a minority of people, the symptoms will persist, and that can lead to the development of a mental health condition called post-traumatic stress disorder, known as PTSD. So according to the DSM-5, PTSD symptoms can be grouped into 4 symptom clusters. So these are intrusive symptoms, avoidance, negative alterations in mood and cognition, and increased arousal. And the numbers in the yellow circles here, they just represent the number of symptoms that are needed from each symptom cluster in order to reach a diagnosis of PTSD. So if we start with intrusive symptoms, these include persistent re-experiencing of the trauma through intrusive memories, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on in the talk, but they also include nightmares and flashbacks. And flashbacks involve a disconnection from reality, where individuals feel as if the distressing event is truly happening to them all over again. Next, we have avoidance. So this could be of internal reminders, so avoiding thoughts or feelings related to the event, but also external reminders, so places, people, situations that are linked to the traumatic experience. Next, we have negative alterations in mood and cognition. So this includes symptoms such as the inability to recall details of the trauma, but it also includes overly negative thoughts or assumptions about oneself or the world. So, for example, blaming oneself for the event happening, or firmly believing that you could have done something different to prevent the traumatic experience from occurring. And obviously, holding these persistent beliefs can be quite distressing for a lot of people, and it sort of sparks feelings of shame and guilt as well. And lastly, there's increased arousal. So this includes symptoms such as hypervigilance, high startle response, and poor sleep. And we know that these symptoms need to persist for at least 1 month in order to be diagnosed with PTSD. So understandably then, many traumatic events may lead someone to interact with the legal system, so whether this be as a victim of interpersonal violence or the witness to a violent crime. And we know that interpersonal violence traumas, such as sexual or physical assault, are associated with the highest risk of PTSD. Other studies have shown that within the first few weeks after assault, 94% of rape victims met symptomatic criteria for PTSD, and around 50% still met these criteria 3 months later. Further, a retrospective study found that 76% of rape victims met diagnostic criteria for PTSD within the year of the assault. So key evidence in many of these cases will be the victim or witness's memories for the event. So how does a traumatic experience affect memory? So we know from clinical observations that people who experience trauma may paradoxically struggle with both the voluntary and involuntary memory of the trauma. So on the one hand, they may have great difficulty in intentionally retrieving a complete memory for the traumatic event. Further, they may report the memory as being fragmented, so having parts missing. They may also struggle to remember the temporal order of events and have an overall incoherent account of what actually happened. This is often referred to as memory disorganization, and some studies investigating self-reported memory characteristics have found that people exposed to a traumatic event with PTSD report greater memory disorganization compared to individuals without PTSD, so exposed to trauma but without PTSD. Yet, on the other hand, individuals suffer with intrusive re-experiencing symptoms, so involuntary memories of the trauma. Intrusive re-experiencing is an umbrella term that refers to several ways in which the memory for a previously experienced event can resurface, whether this is through images, nightmares, or even distressing thoughts about the event when triggered by a trauma reminder. So there's this paradoxical relationship between having great difficulty in intentionally retrieving all aspects of the traumatic event, so thinking back to it, but at the same time people are often plagued with these intrusive memories of the event which occur out of the blue and can often be very distressing. And there's several cognitive models which offer explanations for this paradox and the role of memory in PTSD. And broadly speaking, one viewpoint is that the trauma memory is special and unique in some way, and that this results in the impaired voluntary recall of the trauma, but an enhanced involuntary memories of the trauma. Whereas the other viewpoint is based on autobiographical memory research, and that would argue that memory for stressful or traumatic events enhances both voluntary and involuntary memory, and that the trauma memory is not unique compared to other memories, for example. For this talk, I will focus on one well-known cognitive model, which is the Ellis and Clark cognitive model of PTSD, and this supports the idea that trauma memory is special and unique compared to other types of memory. So in Ellis and Clark's cognitive model of PTSD, they state that PTSD becomes persistent when individuals process the event which leads to a current sense of threat. And this current sense of threat can arise from the nature of the trauma memory or the appraisals of the event and/or its consequences. So as I said, this model supports the view that trauma memory is special and unique compared to other types of autobiographical memory. It proposes that incomplete processing and faulty encoding of the trauma leads to reduced intentional access to the trauma memory, so impaired voluntary access. And specifically, it's thought that shallow processing at the time of the trauma causes the trauma memory to be poorly integrated into autobiographical knowledge. And this lack of integration is thought to be positively related to PTSD symptoms. It also states that faulty encoding leads to fragmented memories, so memories that have details missing, and an unclear temporal order. The linen cupboard metaphor is commonly used to explain the nature of trauma memory in line with this model. So here, memories in PTSD are compared to a messy cupboard, in which many things have been thrown in quite quickly and in a disorganised fashion. So it's difficult to fully close the door, and things fall out at unpredictable times. So whenever you brush past the cupboard, the door flies open and items fall out. And this is thought to be much like when people come across a trauma reminder in the real world and they experience intrusive memories. This is because of the disorganised nature of the memory, causing the trauma memory to intrude on one's awareness. So treatment is compared to organising the cupboard. So looking at each of the items and putting them back in their place in a more organised fashion. This organisation is thought to help elaborate on the trauma memory and better help it incorporate it into existing autobiographical memory base. Consequently, the way that the trauma is encoded and laid down in memory is thought to explain these intrusive memories that people experience. Intrusive re-experiencing occurs in many disorders such as panic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and social anxiety. However, intrusions in these disorders tend to be about future or hypothetical catastrophes, rather than a specific autobiographical memory from the past, as is the case with trauma. Out of all of the re-experiencing symptoms linked to trauma, most research has focused on intrusive memories, which are often brief and vivid image-based recollections of the traumatic event. So, for example, a survivor from a car crash may re-experience the sight of headlights coming towards them, or an assault victim may re-experience the image of an attacker just about to get his knife out. And they're usually involuntary, meaning that they come to mind with no deliberate retrieval attempt, and they typically include strong sensory perceptual elements of the trauma. Studies have shown that intrusive memories reflect the most emotionally salient part of the trauma, and that they can often be perceptions that a person experienced just before the trauma happened. So, for example, hearing footsteps before being attacked, or the sound of the car braking before it hits you. And some researchers would argue that this contributes to the individual's sense of current threat, because the intrusions give the impression that something bad is about to happen, rather than knowing that it's something that has happened in the past. Experiencing intrusive memories after a traumatic event is common, and it's not unique to PTSD, like we said. And for the majority of people, these intrusions will just naturally dissipate over time. However, we do know that some intrusion features are linked to a greater risk of PTSD. So, for example, the degree to which its experience is happening in the here and now, and the degree to which there's a wider range of triggers are all linked to higher rates of PTSD. So it's the persistence and distressing nature of these intrusions which makes them such a hallmark feature of PTSD. So coming back to the Ellis and Clark model, they propose that PTSD sufferers make highly idiosyncratic appraisals about a range of events. So for example, there could be appraisals about how the event happened, so the appraisal that it was my fault, and how they reacted personally during the event, so the appraisal that I should have done more. It's also thought that PTSD sufferers make dysfunctional appraisals about the meaning of symptoms, so for example, the meaning of intrusions. Seeing intrusions as a sign that one is going mad or they're not coping very well. So this raises an interesting question of whether learning to reappraise, does that then help prevent the onset or the development of PTSD symptoms? There's an emerging body of research investigating reappraisal training in analog post-traumatic stress disorder studies using a method called cognitive bias modification, known as CBM. CBM is a computerized training protocol which systematically trains people to process information in a certain way over a series of trials. Typically, CBM has been used to target both attentional and interpretational biases that people may hold. So, for example, CBM for interpretation would help to train people to interpret ambiguous situations in a more positive manner. More recently, however, CBM has been adapted to help target appraisal styles, so to train people to adopt healthier, more functional appraisals. And the CBM task itself appears to participants as a sentence completion task. So participants are asked to read a statement that ends in an incomplete word fragment. So it's their job to complete the word fragment, which, when complete, is then consistent with either a healthy or functional appraisal or a unhealthy or dysfunctional appraisal, depending on the group, the training group that they're allocated to. And several studies have used CBM to modify dysfunctional appraisals in relation to PTSD. So this is in analog studies of PTSD. And Wood and colleagues have got a good review of the literature. So Wood and colleagues as well, they also developed a new CBM training protocol to target negative self-efficacy appraisals. So an example of that would be that the event happened to me because of the sort of person I am. And we know that these types of negative self-efficacy appraisals are linked to PTSD. So for example, some prospective work was conducted where trainee firefighters completed the Post-Traumatic Cognitions Inventory, the PTCI, which measures appraisals. And they completed that before they were exposed to any stressful situations in relation to their work. And these firefighters were then assessed for PTSD symptoms after 6 months and again 4 years later. And the results showed that negative self-efficacy appraisals at baseline predicted subsequent PTSD. So this gives rise to the question then, can we train people to adopt healthy, more functional self-efficacy appraisals, maybe immediately prior to or immediately after a traumatic event, and then would that help prevent the onset or development of PTSD symptoms? And this is something that Wood and colleagues was looking at in this study, and they developed a new CBM training protocol to train people to adopt either positive or negative self-efficacy appraisals. So an example of what the training sentences look like is given here below. So as you can see, the sentence says, somehow since going through the whole experience, something inside me has, and it would be resolved as grown for the positive condition, which is then congruent with a healthy, functional appraisal, or it be resolved as died in the negative condition, which is then consistent with a dysfunctional appraisal. So they tested this training out using the trauma film paradigm. And this involves participants watching either a single or a series of distressing film clips, such as road traffic accidents. And it's a way to mimic trauma exposure in the lab. So in the study, they asked participants to watch a series of distressing film clips, and then participants were randomly allocated to a training group, so either the positive or the negative CBM. After the session 1, all participants completed an intrusion diary over 7 days, so keeping record of any intrusions that they experienced in relation to the film clip they watched at session 1. They came back 7 days later for session 2, handed in the intrusion diary, completed several follow-up measures, including the impact of event scale, which measures analog PTSD symptoms. So this touches on other symptoms of PTSD, which we've mentioned earlier, such as levels of avoidance, hyperarousal, etc. And the results of this study showed that participants who were trained positively at session 1, they reported fewer film intrusions over the week and lower impact of event scale scores, so in other words, lower analog PTSD symptoms compared to those trained negatively. They also replicated this study again, but instead of delivering the training immediately after the trauma film clips, they delivered it immediately prior to. So this is to also investigate whether training prior to trauma also helps prevent the onset and development of PTSD symptoms. So they use the exact same CBM training protocol, so the positive and negative conditions, and the same series of film clips. And what they found here was that participants trained positively reported less distress arising from their intrusions compared to the participants who were trained negatively. So there was no difference in the frequency of intrusions, but there were differences in the amount of distress associated with those intrusions. More recently, Wood and colleagues extended their work to investigate whether the CBM effects can be replicated using individuals' distressing autobiographical events rather than using the trauma film paradigm. Arguably, these personal events are more personally relevant and are thus more important to test out in thinking about the implications for PTSD research. So, broadly speaking, participants recalled a distressing or traumatic event which they personally experienced, and they then received the CBM training, so either the positive or the negative CBM. Participants were asked to complete a 7-day intrusion diary in relation to the distressing event which they'd recalled, and to bring that back to the lab after 1 week to complete session 2. At session 2, they completed several follow-up measures, including PTSD symptoms that were measured again. And the results from the intrusion diary showed that there was no significant difference between intrusion frequency between the training groups. However, there was a significant difference in intrusion distress, with those trained positively reporting less distress compared to those trained negatively. Further, the training also showed that those trained positively had fewer PTSD symptoms compared to the negative group. And this was measured by the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist, which is a self-report questionnaire analysing PTSD symptoms. So to conclude, we know that memory plays a key role in trauma and the development of PTSD. We know that many victims or witnesses of crime will experience trauma symptoms and some will develop PTSD. The persistence of distress and intrusions are hallmark symptoms of PTSD, and evidence shows that dysfunctional appraisals related to the meaning of intrusions contributes to the maintenance of PTSD. CBM offers one avenue to help train people to adopt more functional appraisals, and evidence so far from analogue PTSD studies shows that CBM training has beneficial effects at reducing symptoms. So thank you very much for listening. Please feel free to visit our lab website, which is given below, and follow us on Twitter to keep up with some of the research that we're doing. Thank you very much.